When I saw the Assassin's Creed Shadows PC system requirements, I instantly had a bunch of questions like, oh my, it looks like ray tracing at all times. What exactly does that mean? And how can a GTX 1070, which doesn't have hardware RT support, be listed as a minimum requirement for a ray tracing preset? So I did a little digging on that. I also had other questions though, like, why is this chart so blurry? I went to their official website and I tried to see if there was any way to get this in a higher resolution, and I could not. So it's super blurry. They do have everything in text down below, which is nice, but why is this chart so low res if you're gonna have this fine print of text? Anyway, I'll dig into this ray tracing stuff in just a second, but first I want to point out, because it's hard to read, this says that all of the resolution and FPS numbers are using dynamic resolution and upscaling, which means that this chart doesn't really tell us how this game performs, which is frustrating. I understand that game developers realize that many people are going to be using upscaling when they play the game, which is also why I don't necessarily hate them including upscaling in a system requirements chart, as long as they are clear about at what settings. Is this DLSS quality or is it DLSS performance? Because if you're using DLSS performance at 1080p, it looks awful. That's a 540p internal rendering resolution. But if it's DLSS quality, I still don't like it, but it's much less of a disaster. So anyway, that's extremely frustrating. So if you're gonna include upscaling in your system requirements chart, please include at what level. Although it is dynamic resolution scaling, so maybe that's what they're using. But then again, that really then doesn't tell us much about the performance, does it? So anyway, all of that's frustrating. But again, what about all this ray tracing stuff? Because it seems like ray tracing at all times. And also, how is a 1070 supported? So basically, I tried to research if they had given any info on this, and I found this post on the Assassin's Creed subreddit where developers do explain what is meant by all of these things. Here's the basic summary. I'll link the source in the description if you want to read further details. Selective RT mode means that there is ray tracing, but not in the open world gameplay sections. It is only in the, they call it the hideout section of the game, which I think is more of like a base area. So anyway, they're saying that selective RT is only in the hideout, not in open world. Whereas as you move up to standard ray tracing, it has global illumination in the open world, and in the extended ray tracing, it has global illumination and reflections. The selective RT mode, again, only in the hideout, I believe is only global illumination. But then there's also the question about still, how is a 1070 or an RX 5700 supported if they don't have hardware RT capabilities? They do explain that here, where they say that if your GPU does not support hardware ray tracing, such as pre-RTX GPUs, we have developed our own solution to allow competent yet older GPUs to run Assassin's Creed Shadows. The game will use a proprietary software-based ray tracing approach developed specifically for that. So basically, they did develop a software RT fallback for global illumination in the hideout, and the reason that the hideout needs a real-time GI technique rather than a baked technique is because they're saying that there's a extensive amount of customization. So they couldn't bake in the lighting. It has to be done in real time, so they're relying on ray tracing, but did provide a software fallback. So all of that to me actually sounds pretty good. So basically, if you're in this selective RT mode, you're not actually using RT in the open world unless you want to turn it on and jump up to one of these settings, but the hideout area has a software fallback for GPUs that don't support RT. That all seems pretty good, honestly. But now let's dig into what sort of performance are we actually getting, although again, this is totally hindered by the fact that it's based on dynamic resolution and upscaling. However, I actually have the CPUs jumping out at me a little bit here. So before we talk about GPUs, you do need to think about your CPU, because they're saying for 1080p 30 FPS with some level of upscaling, but upscaling doesn't really affect the kind of work the CPU does. So to hit 30 FPS is basically how you would read this at the lowest possible settings. They're saying an Intel Core i7 8700K or a Ryzen 5 3600. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't overshoot this and you couldn't run it on an older CPU, but again, for the lowest possible stuff, and when they're listing things like a GTX 1070, these might be better than what some systems with the 1070 actually have. So do be careful on that. These seem more in line with the kind of CPU power that a PlayStation 5 has, for example. It's generally pretty similar in performance to Ryzen 5 3600. So anyway, now does that mean that the PlayStation 5 is going to struggle to hit 60 FPS? I don't know, guys, because if you look at this, to go up to 60 FPS, and again, at some sort of upscaled 1080p, but again, that doesn't really affect the CPU. Although we are moving up from low settings to medium, some graphic settings do affect CPU performance, like, for example, crowd density, also some ray tracing, like computing the BVH, things like that. But generally, graphic settings don't have too big of an impact on the CPU. Crowd density is one of the bigger ones. They're jumping from a 3600 to a 5600X. The 5600X is generally stronger than what is in a PlayStation 5. They're also jumping to an Intel Core i5 11600K, so a pretty big jump on the Intel one as well. So from the CPU requirement, it's looking like to hit 60 FPS, you are going to want something like a Ryzen 5 5600 or 11600K, because notice when they move up to 1440p 60, increasing to high settings, but still 60 FPS is the most important part when you're looking at CPUs. It's more about the frame rate rather than the resolution. They're keeping the 11600K and the 5600X. Now, past that point, they do jump up at 4K 60 and staying at the high settings to a 12700K or Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. I would mostly read that as nonsense because if you're staying at the same graphic settings and the same frame rate, you generally are not increasing the burden on the CPU. Increasing the resolution, which is the only change here, increases the burden on the GPU, has generally very little, if any, impact on the CPU. So jumping from a 5600X to a 5800X 3D doesn't make any sense if you're just increasing the resolution. So that's more likely that they just had a high-end build that they tested and then confirmed it worked at 4K 60 at high settings. Anyway, so keep that in mind when you're reading these types of charts. I'm hoping they're overshooting the CPU requirement a bit, but in a dense populated environment, sometimes there is a big CPU burden, and that is sometimes even challenging to maintain 60 FPS in a lot of games on even a PS5 or something like that. So do keep that in mind. Now, let's jump into the GPUs. So the minimums are the 1070 or the Radeon RX 5700 or an Intel Arc A580. Notice that is not the newer B580, that is the A580, which is much weaker. These GPUs, let's go ahead and go to Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart. This can be useful, first of all, to make sense of what they're saying, but also if you don't have some kind of encyclopedic knowledge of every GPU in existence and they're not listing the one that you have, you might want help understanding how your GPU fits into this. So I will link this source in the video description. What you do is you click on one of the GPUs that are listed in the system requirements chart, and then you scroll to weaker GPUs or to stronger GPUs, and you find your GPU. Then, if you've clicked on the one listed in the system requirements chart, that's set that to 100%, and the other GPUs are showing a percentage change from there. So for example, the Radeon RX 5700 that they listed is generally about 23% more powerful than the GTX 1070 that they listed. So they either perform similarly in this game, and this chart is showing the averages, or they're just saying that they tested both of these and they were around 30 FPS. Maybe the 5700 was doing better than 30, but that doesn't mean it was doing enough better than 30 to list a completely different GPU. Does that make sense? Anyway, the Arc A580 is right there alongside the 5700 in general. Now, those are the types of GPUs it's saying to get an upscaled 30 FPS with a 1080p output. How aggressive is the upscaling is gonna be a big part on how I feel about this. If that's like performance mode upscaling, that's pretty rough just to hit 30 FPS. If that's quality level upscaling, it's less disastrous. Now, as far as recommended, I have similar feelings regarding this is going to depend a lot on the upscaling, because for 1080p 60 at medium, they're listing a 3060 Ti or a 6700 XT or an Intel Arc B580. Again, that's jumping from the A to the B580. Now, a 3060 Ti and a 6700 XT are often thought of as, well, at least when they launched, 1440p GPUs that maybe use quality level upscaling for that, especially if you're down at medium settings. But this is saying 1080p 60 with upscaling. If it's a tiny bit of dynamic res scaling just to keep you at 60 in the hardest areas, that's much less concerning than if they're like, this is performance mode upscaling. Now, performance mode upscaling at 1080p would be awful, but like we saw games recently, not from the same publisher, but Monster Hunter Wilds, for example, listed its recommended GPU as using performance mode upscaling at 1080p to not even hit 60 FPS and then use frame gen. So You can never know what publishers or developers are meaning when they say there's resolution scaling enabled in these kinds of system requirements charts. So 6700 XT or 3060 Ti, those are pretty powerful GPUs for 1080p upscaled medium settings just to hit 60, in my opinion. Anyway, how does that compare to the minimum specs? Well, 1070 set as our baseline. If I now scroll up again, maybe you'll see your GPU somewhere in here. To get to the 3060 Ti, which by the way is stronger than a 4060 by a little bit, or a 6700 XT, we're basically increasing performance by about 75 to 80%. And the 3060 Ti and the 6700 XT and the B580 are all in a similar performance tier. So from that perspective, this pairing does make sense. And again, almost doubling performance, and we're also going from about 30 to about 60. Seems reasonable, although we're also going from low settings to medium settings, and we have no idea how much dynamic res scaling is being used here and whether it's at an equivalent amount at this one as at this one, which is why it's so frustrating to have that in the chart as just this unknown factor. Anyway, that's where we're at here. Like I said, how I feel about it depends a lot on how much it's relying on resolution scaling to hit 1080p 60 medium on these GPUs. And also, what does that look like? Because medium might look astounding. Anyway, if you're moving up to enthusiast tier, they're saying it's 1440p 60 high settings. So basically you're staying at 60 FPS, but you're moving up to 1440p and you're increasing settings from medium to high. They're saying to do that, you'll go up to a 3080 10 gigabyte or a 6800 XT, which has 16 gigabytes, but if a 10 gigabyte card can do it, we don't know if an 8 gigabyte can, but they're at least saying 10 gigabytes is enough for 1440p 60 high. Now, how much is that increasing from where we were at? Well, if I set the 3060 Ti as the baseline, that's where we were at for 1080p 60 medium. They're saying that now, and again, maybe you'll spot your GPU somewhere in here, if we scroll up to the 3080, that's about a 52% performance increase to go from medium settings to high and from 1080p to 1440p. But again, we have no idea if they're also going more aggressive on the DLSS here, which I actually kind of think they are if it's only a 50% performance increase in their ask in order to also go from 1080p to 1440p, but also from medium to high. Although maybe medium to high doesn't change the impact of the performance much. But I'm suspicious that they're using more aggressive upscaling here at 1440p than they are at 1080p. Again, at 1440p, I'm fine with DLSS quality. If it goes beyond that, it starts to be a bit more questionable. And if you're wondering if it's the new DLSS 4, no, it's DLSS 3.7 and FSR 3.1. Again, there's ways to swap in newer versions, which is nice, but it will be shipping, it looks like, with 3.7 and FSR 3.1. Now, what if you want to play at 4K 60 high settings? Well, it's looking like you need to jump up to a 4070 Ti Super or a 7900 XT. But this is where I feel like at 4K, they're using way more aggressive upscaling. Because if we look at this, if I set the 3080 as the baseline now, and then we look at the 4070 Ti Super, it's actually not that much more powerful. So if we scroll up here, again, maybe you'll spot your GPU in here. The 4070 Ti Super is only 28% more powerful on average than a 3080 10 gigabyte, which means that this is nonsense if you are otherwise just keep staying at the same settings with no difference in like what level of upscaling you were using and going from 1440p to 4K. Because 4K has way more pixels than 1440p. It is a lot more demanding, not just 28% more demanding. So my guess is 4K is probably using DLSS performance mode, which again at 4K can look decent, especially if you update to the newer transformer model. And hopefully that means that 1440p was maybe relying more on quality and maybe 1080p was just a touch of dynamic scaling here and there as needed. That's what I'm hoping. If all of these are just super aggressive performance mode, then I've got some concerns. Anyway, what if we jump up to the actually turning on ray tracing in the open world? It looks like that's going to be incredibly demanding because they're saying that the 1080p 30 FPS, and I was hoping this was just blurred out and I couldn't read it, but no, if you check the actual text that they have down below, for 1080p 30 FPS with, sorry, that's the minimum, sorry, here we go, standard ray tracing, for 1080p 30 FPS with the high settings, but then you're turning on the ray trace GI in the open world, they are indeed saying that you need an RTX 2070 or an ARC B580 in order to do this. Also here, it doesn't look like they're listing an AMD GPU. Do we get one in the picture? We do get one in the picture, so that's interesting. Anyway, they're not even consistent on these. The 6700 XT or the 2070 for 30 FPS at 1080p, and remember, that's not even native, that's including some level of resolution scaling. We don't know at what level. That feels pretty brutal for 30 FPS at 1080p, just saying. To go to 1440p at 60 FPS, they're asking for a 4070 Super or a 7800 XT. And again, that's with the RTGI in the open world and the high visual settings as the baseline. If you want to use the ultra settings as the baseline and keep RTGI in the open world and turn on RT reflections, they're asking for quite a bit here, considering that it's already including some level of resolution scaling. For 1440p 60 maxed out, RTX 4080. For 4K 60 maxed out, 4090. And again, that is already including some resolution scaling. How much? I don't know. But an upscaled 1440p 60 for a 4080 feels pretty demanding. So I'm hoping those RT reflections look really, really good to justify that. Anyway, that's where we're at, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments section. Do you want me to benchmark this when it comes out? Because they are stating, there's some more details here, that there is an in-game benchmark tool. So hopefully it's somewhat reflective of actual gameplay, but that would make side-by-sides pretty easy to gather when the game launches if you're interested. Comes out on, I believe it was March 20th. They're also noting ultra-wide support, which is nice, as well as HDR support, dynamic res support. Also, SSD is mandatory, and you do want at least 16 gigabytes of RAM. That's what I got for you guys today. Let me know if you want me to benchmark this when it launches, and have an excellent day.